Welcome, everybody, to the third POLIMP webinar in a series of 8. A series of live discussions for viewing as they happen and as a recording that we at Ecologic Institute are organizing under a project called POLIMP, financed by the European Union. It's a Directorate for Research and Innovation that brings together organizations from 7 different countries led by Joint Implementation Network in the Netherlands. We're very happy that you are joining us today. The mission of the project is to communicate information on EU and international climate policy in an easy-to-access format. And so this is one of the many tools that we're using to do this. As such, the POLIMP Webinar Series focuses on contemporary issues and EU and international climate policy. And today our topic is: why is the term governance currently an issue under discussion when it comes to talking about the future of EU climate and energy policy? And to talk about this topic with us today, we're very privileged to have 2 expert speakers with us this morning. First off, my dear fellow colleague from Ecologic Institute, Katharina Umpfenbach, who is a senior fellow at the Ecologic Institute and also our coordinator on energy policy issues. Thank you for joining us, Katharina. And then we also have with us Jonathan Gaventa, who is with us from London this morning. He's a director at E3G, Environmentalism Third Generation. Very welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
So we specifically wanted to kick off with more fundamental questions. The term governance usually describes a system and a set of rules for organizing how decisions are being taken. And as such, in the European Union, we have a whole host of institutions. We have the treaties that organize and set out the rules, and we have legislation for specific policy areas. And so for climate and energy policy, this is actually a complex set of existing rules and pieces of legislation that apply and come together to define currently how this policy area is organized between the European institutions and how member states are being involved. However, as far as I can recall, this has never really been much of an explicit issue in EU climate and energy policy before to talk about governance. But as per the last year for sure, if not the last year and a half, this is coming to the fore as a central topic of debate. And so I would like to start us off with the question, if you can help us unpack a little bit the issue and why we are talking about it right now. And I would kindly invite Katharina to start off with an attempt at an answer at this. Thank you.
In 2008, we agreed a 2020 package on energy and climate to start decarbonizing our economy. And as you said, it was made up of a number of directives, decisions, and other legislation. We now have a bit more than 7 years of experience with it. And actually, I think it's important to, before we talk about all the challenges, to say that we've achieved quite a lot. We've reduced our GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the EU by more than we were aiming for 2020 last year. So over the 2020 target already. We've extended renewables in quite a speed that I think no one really expected to happen that fast. We've driven down cost, we've improved on energy efficiency, and actually we are now at a point where these first experiences have transformed our system, especially our energy system, to a point where this is no longer happening in an environmental little niche, but it's sort of changing the whole system. And now, looking at all these successes, we still obviously have quite a bumpy road ahead of us, quite a challenge ahead of us to reach full decarbonization by 2050. And when the heads of states in October 2014 agreed that future carbon reduction targets for 2030, they have all this experience in mind, and I think one of the challenges and one of the reasons we're talking about governance, to come back to your questions, is that the experience in have been quite different. And different from 2008, member states have now experience to look back to, and they are reasserting sovereignty over policy. Some of them are more than others. And this comes at a time where, in addition to that energy policy sovereignty debate, we also have some tendencies.
Just a very quick interruption.
Yes.
My apologies. I think we are experiencing minor technical issues, and since we are actually doing this from the very same building, I think in the interest of conducting this in a fashion that everybody can enjoy, I would invite you to come over and join me here at this table.
Okay.
And I think you gave us an sort of an initial outline on some of the context, and as you're making your way over to this screen, I would like to ask Jonathan to give us sort of his expanded view on sort of the general context of why we're talking about this issue right now. Katharina was starting to explain what the thinking of the European Commission had been early in 2014.
Yeah, indeed. I'd just like to echo a couple of the things that Katharina has already outlined. For me, really at the crux of the question about EU energy and climate governance is how is the sort of the mechanisms, the institutions, the legal basis through which Europe meets its energy and climate goals on an ongoing basis. And not just that, but sort of meets all of them on an ongoing basis rather than trading off one piece against another. Katharina started to outline some of the targets that have been set. We've got some very explicit targets, for example, on greenhouse gases or renewables, and then some sort of vague wishes and hopes and objectives for EU energy climate policy as well, which are often expressed in terms of competitiveness or affordability or security as well. And it's the governance system needs to build that in at the same time as the targets that have been more specified. For me, I think there's Katharina has outlined that we've certainly come a long way on this agenda in recent years. Looking forwards, I see really the challenge that revisions to the EU energy and climate governance needing to address is really about how to deliver more coherence to the system. At the moment, we do have some very powerful mechanisms and tools and institutions at our disposal, but they're not always fully aligned. And I think there's really three dimensions of governance incoherence that need to be addressed in the forthcoming changes. But the first of them is the sort of the geographical incoherence or geographical splits between what happens between different member states or between what happens at the member state level and the European level, or even the sort of city level down there, member state level over there, European level there. We're seeing situations in which policies and approaches taken in one member state really don't always fit that well or that efficiently with the actions taken by their neighbours or at EU level. And decisions that make sense individually don't always add up to a really sort of coherent and efficient system as a whole. So this is really about how to make Europe work collectively more efficiently. The second dimension of incoherence that really needs to be addressed in the governance system is one of coherence between sectors. In the Twitter conversation in the run-up to this webinar, we had a question raised about whether we're talking about energy governance or climate governance. And it's actually quite an important question, I think, because up until now we've seen sort of a different institutional basis, a different legal basis for how Europe addresses climate and energy. And the two don't always match up very well or very seamlessly. We do now have one commissioner for both energy and climate, which might make progress. But some of the legal frameworks still don't always match up quite as seamlessly as they could. And similarly, there's differences between different energy sectors and vectors in terms of policy and approaches. and particularly the demand side of the energy market is not always placed on an equal footing to the supply side. So we've got, at European level, we've got institutions like the European Network of Transmission System Operators playing a sort of a formal role, but we don't have a similar body representing and promoting the interests of demand side or efficiency. And just the final sort of layer of incoherence that I think needs to be addressed is the temporal one. What the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney recently called the tragedy of the horizon, and that's really a question of EU decision makers, national decision makers necessarily live in the present and have to respond to the pressures that they face, all the immediate crises. But what's built on the ground as a result of those decisions often has a lifetime of 30, 40 years or more. And by the time we get towards 2050, Europe does need to have moved to a pretty comprehensively decarbonized energy system. And so there won't be a lot of room on the system left for some of the high carbon infrastructure that is continuing to be built in Europe. And the government system should be a way of helping to make those decisions a bit more coherent and sound.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for this initial way of structuring what the background is here. I want to pick up on 2 points, one after another. The first one is on what the actual proposals are for how to deal with this situation, but I'd also like to come back to this other point that I heard both of you allude to, which is that I sense there is a bit of an inherent contradiction between the context and the general atmosphere at the European level, where there's almost a sense of the need for member states to reassert themselves and a sense of renationalization, versus the need for more coherence and more integration moving forward. And so I think that second piece I would also very much like to come back to. But to start with, and maybe I can come back to Jonathan first, could you let us know a little bit more about what is being proposed to deal with this situation?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think it's important to clarify that we're not talking about one single proposal being put on the table here. There's not going to be a big bang moment or a declaration of independence or a Treaty of Rome or anything setting out the governance system in its entirety. Rather, the way that the Commission is approaching it at the moment is a gradual process being developed, similar to the way that the European semester system started broad and then was sort of built up and became more formal over time. In terms of what concretely we expect to see in relation to the climate and energy targets, we expect them to be reflected in revisions to the EU emissions trading scheme for emissions that are covered under that. And for emissions that aren't covered under that, it should be reflected in an update to the effort sharing decision. In addition, we expect to see a revisiting of the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Renewable Energy Directive, again to reflect the decisions made by the European Council in October last year. But in addition to these individual legislative files, we're also expecting to see a sort of an overarching chapeau aimed at expressing the governance layer a bit more crisply and coherently. That will have at least two elements to it. The first is that the Commission has committed to coming forward every year with a State of the Energy Union publication that will outline progress and how all the various pieces fit together. And then the second is that we expect to see proposals for member states to publish their own national energy and climate change plans that set out the actions that they expect to take to contribute towards the target and towards the broader energy union objectives up to 2030 and hopefully to 2050 as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Is there something specific you would like to add to this point, Katharina? Or shall I?
No.
Then let me actually sort of move on to that second point that I raised earlier. So it's both about the different interests represented in member states and that we had as a specific question also in the live feed on questions that all of you can use that are joining us live to pose additional questions or to vote up or down individual ones. So we're going to tackle that member states question now, as well as the potential difference between the Council and the Commission. So, let's start off with the member state side and Germany. Katharina is obviously a member state that you have a very clear and good insight on. Germany has been a champion for more advanced and more progressive EU climate and energy policy. How is Germany positioning itself in this potential inherent contradiction of having to do more at the European level, but also maybe wanting to preserve what's happening at the national level?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think this is a key point for explaining, also coming back to the very first question, why we have this governance conversation. This wish for flexibility, that's how it's often framed, this sovereignty demand at member state level, and the need for coherence, which Jonathan just lined out for the EU collectively. And I think the most obvious sort of illustration of this conflict has been the decision of the European Council to agree for an EU-level binding target on renewable energy of 27% by 2030, but not break it down to national targets that make then up this EU collective target, as we had in the past for the 2020, or still binding on us for 2020. So this is a break with the past system, and that is one of the reasons where this governance debate came from, because how will we achieve an EU collective target if member states are not having to take on individual national contributions? And this also links well to Germany, because, as we all know, renewables have been expended quite swiftly in Germany, and there is a huge interest of the German government for others in the EU to follow and to work with us together to transform the whole system, especially the electricity system, but also the other sectors, so that renewables can become the main pillar, together with reduced consumption and demand response, to deliver our electricity of the future. And so in the governance framework, as a consequence of that, which the German government has again and again demanded from the Commission to propose something that is reliable and robust, and that answers the so-called what-if question. So the question, what happens if national contributions, both on energy efficiency and renewables, do not add up to the targets that have been agreed at EU level? So that has been the recurrent theme. On the other subjects, or the other topics, on the wider sort of integration of the energy market, interconnection, all the other themes that are also connected to this agenda, the German government has been a lot less demanding, let's say, for reliable governance. So you already see that national interest also influence how demands are phrased at EU level.
So, that I'd play that ball straight over to Jonathan, because, of course, you have very good insights on the conversations within the United Kingdom, and the UK traditionally is another stalwart advocate, certainly for ambitious climate policy in the European Union. But as I understand it, the UK and the Germans do not necessarily see eye to eye entirely on the question of how to design the governance system for 2030.
Yes, certainly. I think that's a good way of describing it. It's worth remembering that, of course, that both the UK and Germany did agree that this language of an EU binding renewables target for 2030 at the European Council meeting in October last year. But also this concept of an EU binding renewables target was it's a novelty. It's hitherto unheard of, and so the challenge that we've got now is to try to figure out what that actually means, because it clearly can't have a situation in which something is EU binding but has no actual tangible practical applications to the 28 member states that collectively make up the EU. I think it's worth saying that there is a strong current of thought in the UK government that think that signing up to the 2020 renewables target was a mistake. There are people in the Treasury and a few other parts of government who think that making that commitment back in 2008, 2009 placed more costs on the UK than it should have done, and it means that we're not decarbonising in the cheapest way possible. Now, I think you can point to the cost reductions in renewable energy, and you can point to the delays in the nuclear program, the delays in the CCS program, to say actually that viewpoint has been overtaken by the facts on the ground. But it hasn't yet filtered back into the political system entirely. So when it came to the 2030 targets, the UK was pushing for a stronger greenhouse gas target of minus 50% rather than the at least 40% that was eventually agreed, but was pushing against having any form of nationally binding renewables target. And so one of the priorities that has been taken by the UK government after this decision is to try to avoid the nationally binding renewables target coming back on the table. And so that's really the context for some quite difficult discussions. The more recent context that we've had since the elections in May is that the UK has committed to a referendum on its future membership of the EU sometime between now and the end of 2017. And that has made everyone very cautious and very sensitive about saying anything or doing anything that might blow up into a media story in the tabloids. And so as a result of this, we've had a very sort of slow and cautious approach. But I think there is a basic recognition that the EU binding renewables target must mean something. They're just still fighting over what it is.
Mm-hmm. I think but the UK, with its desire also, for there to be seen to be less of a strong and potentially intervening role of Europe / Brussels, is joined in what it is therefore asking at present of the governance system by other countries, if I understand correctly. So could you maybe, Jonathan, talk about who the UK is essentially sort of aligning itself with and what the interests of other member states are that are having similar thoughts?
Certainly on the renewables aspect, the UK has agreed common positions. In fact, even published a common non-paper with the Czech Republic, and has also aligned itself with the Visegrad group, who are collectively pushing for a more light touch approach to the renewables governance issue, and also to the planning and reporting system in general. Mm-hmm. And it's worth noting that those positions don't always line up entirely, and the Visegrad group itself is not necessarily saying we want less European governance. In fact, sort of Poland can claim original authorship of the Energy Union theme, which was sparked in part due to energy security fears and a recognition of the strong role that European solidarity can play in that. But they have been cautious about accepting any national obligations, particularly on renewables.
Yeah. So the situation seems to be rather complex in terms of the landscape that is, sort of building on this very specific issue. Who are, some of the other interests? Katharina, could you add maybe a perspective for, France or other progressives on climate and energy policy in Europe?
Well, taking up the progressives first, in addition to Germany, I think we have a coalition of smaller member states. They sometimes call themselves, it's not my invention, the green dwarfs. So that's Denmark, Sweden, Portugal specifically. All countries that have, as Germany, pushed forward with renewables quite ambitiously early on and have long-term targets for continuing to doing so, and have thus an interest in others joining them. Portugal in particular, to show that each member state has his own little, or his own agenda. Portugal is especially interested also in being able to sell renewables to other countries beyond Spain, and for that they need interconnection, so they need cables basically. So the interconnection target that has also been agreed in October last year is very important for Portugal. So we have interests that even in the progressive group that overlap in parts, and might be, you know, Germany is not as keen on making interconnection such a big topic. And then we have France, which is a little bit, I would say, in the middle and indecisive. They've just gone through a process, an internal process, and that's always important to keep in mind, an internal process of an energy transition law that is now adopted but lacks detail, as much as I understand from our French colleagues, lacks detail on how it will be implemented. They have the huge legacy, obviously, of their nuclear industry that brings its own struggles. So in France, we're seeing, at least that's my take from a little bit from the outside, an indecisive role, but a strong ambition on climate, obviously, since they're hosting the Paris Summit in a few weeks from now. So they have an interest, and that's also why they agreed on the energy transition law at this point in time. They have an interest to being a strong host, ensuring a good and robust outcome of the international negotiation. So their main interest is climate, but they're a bit less ambitious on energy policy.
Thank you very much. I thought it was interesting, sort of considering you know, this complexity and the different interests among member states. That sort of, I think I took you both as saying that in essence the decisions from October 2014 last year on the changes to the target architecture for renewables in particular represent essentially then a compromise between the different you know, ends of the tug of war there, coherence to flexibility. And sort of at this point, I actually want to bring in as an impulse the results from a survey that we've done as part of the POLIMP project, where we've established an expert response group to do short surveys that actually are on similar topics as the webinar series. And switching to that slide now, I want to show you that the experts that we asked on issues related to governance last week, that they had a very strong reaction as to their opinion on what this actually means, that we're having a shift now from a system towards 2020, where on renewables there was not just an EU binding target, but this was broken down to binding targets at the member state level. And so they were in general agreement that this was a very significant change in the system. And also there was very low approval across the group, but low approval with a majority that were saying, you know, we strongly disapprove, but actually a very high variability in the responses, meaning that there was disagreement on this point. And so what I want to do is take this as a starting point to ask the two of you whether you think, you know, what elements of the proposal for how future governance system could evolve, how can this potentially deal with the concerns that people have, or could it exacerbate the concerns that people have? So, you know, can the future governance system improve the certainty for renewables in Europe despite the absence of binding target at the member state level, or, you know, could it even get this situation sort of into worse waters. And maybe, Katharina, would you like to start?
Well, I think both are possible. It could get worse, it could get better. I think what's important to keep in mind if we think about renewables, and I'm mostly thinking of the power sector because that's where we've seen the biggest extension, where we have a big potential to go forward. I think a key thing for investors is of course to know that the commitment to renewables is real. So yes, reliability, some form of enshrine at least intention to act if the target is in danger of being missed would be key to, you know, give investors the certainty that they need to plan investments. But I think it doesn't stop there, and Jonathan already alluded to that. I think now that we're going towards a system in the impact assessment, the Commission says that in power sector at least we're expecting almost 50% renewables by 2030. So we're not talking of a little protected niche as we were back in 2008. We're talking about a pillar of the system. So I think what is at least as important is that in all the other areas, so I'm talking of the market rules, of the grid planning, of all the interconnections that are planned between countries in the way we assess security of supply in the power sector, that in these areas as well, renewables and especially obviously variable renewables, because it will be mainly wind and solar that we're expecting to see built over the next years, are fully taken into account both in their technical, in the way they operate, and in their market, in the economics, because they have very different economics from coal plants. It's mostly capital cost, little running cost. So this is key, that we don't think of renewables as the little niche which need their renewable energy directive. They also need to become a core part of the internal energy market of the European Union.
Thank you. Jonathan, is there something that you would like to add on this topic?
Yeah, just two reactions, I suppose. The first is to put in context what we're talking about. From the most recent numbers that I've seen, the EU is looking like it's going to be on track to get to 20 to 21% renewables by 2020, following these nationally binding renewables targets and legally binding renewables targets that it's previously agreed. So actually what we're talking about is, over the course of a decade, only to add sort of 6% more renewables onto the system than were there before. And we're seeing that in a context in which really some of the price reductions of solar, of wind, of some of the other technologies have been quite phenomenal. So I'm not a gambling man, but I'd be willing to stake that by the time we do get to 2030, the 27% number will be seen as actually quite small. But to have the confidence of going forward, we do need a backstop there to answer the question of, well, what if the national plans don't add up? You also need, as Katharina explained, to build in the direction of travel, not just to the target structures, but everything that's being done at EU level, to the market design, to the grid planning, etc., and also to where the EU spends its money. It's an example I often use, and will keep using until it's fixed. But at the moment, when the EU is prioritizing where to spend its Connecting Europe facility money and where it's which projects it's designating as projects of common interests, the assessments being used aren't fully in line with the energy efficiency targets, aren't fully in line with the renewables targets in terms of how much gas demand there's going to be, how much power demand there's going to be, and where that's going to be located. So this is a sort of a clear example of how the governance can be improved by building in the direction of travel across the piece.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I struggle with, and I think is going to be a big topic for political debate, is then to envisage a system where a lot of the different topics are supposedly, as per the proposal, how I understand it from the European Commission, being brought together in joined-up planning, potentially helping to solve some of the coherence issues and supporting renewables with the need for integration of the markets that you alluded to. But as I understand it, it's still unclear as to how that is going to be enshrined in legislation. And at present, we have all these very different strands. So I think I'm rolling two questions into one here, but I'll focus on the first part, which is, what is your sense of the need for a legal basis on how the system is going to be working going forward? You know, at present, all of this is enshrined in legislation. I think member states that prefer more of a light touch on these governance issues going forward would probably prefer to have less of that, you know, locked up in legislation. What is your take on the pros and cons of this issue? And maybe, Jonathan, could you start, please?
Well, I think I want to start by challenging the notion that a light touch approach is in the interests of member states. It may well mean that there's less homework for the civil servants to do, and I can understand why that's being pushed. But we are moving into a European energy system that is much more interconnected and interdependent than it ever has been in the past. And as a result, the decisions made in one member state will affect the context and the markets of all of their neighbors. So actually, if countries want to be able to make the sorts of policies to achieve their own aims, they do need a good view of what sorts of decisions are being made, what objectives are being planned in the countries around them. And having a standard way of developing these plans, of testing them with neighbours and across the region, and of having them independently evaluated is a really important way of doing that. And so I think member states shouldn't be afraid of legislation, and they should see it as an opportunity to make their own energy system planning more robust and more successful.
Katharina?
Yes, well, I agree. I also think that legislation has served us very well in the past. Another point of another difference in having legislation or a process that is light touch and mostly bilateral between the Commission and Member States is that legislation brings the European Parliament in. And I think that's crucial for legitimacy. It's also crucial for stakeholder access, lots of things. So when we're moving to legislation next year, and it seems now that that is getting ever more concrete, we will have a very different set of stakeholders involved in this discussion, and that's important. So yes, we need legislation. I also think, though, that we should not. We should ensure that whatever governance approach we have and planning approach we have is open to adaptation over time. So we should, I think the wish for flexibility, it's not only about national interests, it's also about being able to adapt to new conditions that arise all the time and that we've also seen arising over the last with the last package. So we should make sure that there's options for adapting.
I think that specific point reminds me, I think it's a Dwight Eisenhower quote on plans are nothing, but planning is everything. And I want to take that actually and come to the second part of what I was alluding to earlier. So I think you already explained that the Commission proposal is for member states to elaborate plans that would bring together the issues that we currently are dealing with certainly in separate pieces of legislation and also in the current architecture in, say, a national plan on energy efficiency and a national plan for renewables, etc. And so the heads of state and government last year in October 2014 also very explicitly said that they would want to see a streamlining of those processes in order to reduce the administrative effort required by member states. And this I assume is a desire that can both just have a very positive effect of reducing effort and creating synergies where they exist, but I assume also may have its drawbacks. And I would like for both of you to briefly sort of help us reflect on what the options are here and what the drawbacks and potential advantages are. Katharina, I know that you've done a more extensive work on this. We can't get into a lot of the technicalities here, but could you give us an outline of this part of the conversation, please?
Yes, well, streamlining has been up early on the agenda, sometimes to the point that the whole governance has been reduced to the idea of streamlining planning and reporting, which it should not, obviously. But having said that, I think that the original idea to make the planning and reporting processes more slim and more coherent is a legitimate one. There, I think, is a fear in the environmental community that it's only a pretext to basically get rid of anything reliable and plannable, and I understand that. But I think, on the other hand, if you look what we did at the sort of acquis, we call it, so all the reporting and planning requirements that there are, not only on renewables and energy efficiency, but also under the effort sharing decision, under grid planning, and so forth, you see that there are quite a lot of overlaps, and going forward they will actually increase these overlaps as the system gets more interconnected, are poised to get even bigger. So there is room to cut the work and make it more coherent, more accurate at the same time, because we have to think that some member states are really small and they're facing this huge burden of reporting and data requirements. Mm-hmm. And what happens is that they don't provide accurate data, which is should not be the case going forward. So I think one really good way of doing this streamlining is to get the underlying data on what kind of supply side and demand side development we expect in the energy field and in the different sectors. Aligned is one of the easiest way to streamline. But so that's sort of the benefit that we can get, and I think the Commission is starting a process now on improving what they call the reference scenario. So hopefully that will deliver at least parts of that. The risk, and you already mentioned that, is that we throw out the baby with the bathtub, as we say, and only have those high-level energy and climate plans that Jonathan alluded to, with no underlying evidence. Again, when you look at the existing acquis, a lot of the reporting that member states do is not only on data and projections, how to reach targets, it's also on implementing measures. So what do we do to, for instance, achieve grid priority for all renewables? Or what do we do to ensure security of supply in the electricity sector? So if we were to integrate all of this information in one plan, it would be either such a large volume of information that it would not be practical, or it would reduce the level of detail to a point where the Commission would not be able to follow up if member states are really implementing the measures that are in the directive. So what we think would be a good way forward would be to have high-level plans that sort of have the main targets, national priorities in energy policy and climate policy, in a very sort of reduced and coherent format, and then have underlying that a set of more detailed plans and reports that could still be reduced compared to what we have now, but would deliver more detail than the energy and climate plans could.
That sounds like an interesting proposal for trying to make this happen in a way that not much quality is lost. Jonathan. What do you make of this specific suggestion, or do you have additional thoughts that you'd like to add?
Well, I have to say, every time I hear the word streamlining, my heart sinks. It's one of the ugliest phrases in the English language, alongside mainstreaming sustainability, because it's a phrase that no one can be against. I mean, streamlining sounds great, right? Mainstreaming sustainability sounds great. But it can be used for all kinds of different purposes. And so I think it's actually really, really important that the detail of what is being proposed and the options are really thoroughly and properly assessed. And I would strongly commend the Ecologic Institute's work in this area. I know other assessments have also been done by Client Earth and by IDRI in Paris, and so I hope they will continue to keep a close eye on the detail of what might be coming out of these processes.
Thank you very much. I think I have to say I really enjoyed this conversation. I want to thank both of you for sharing your insights, and as a means of just coming to a little bit of a summary for me, what this conversation shows is, this seems to be a topic that tries to, really get at the heart of how future EU climate and energy policy is organized, and it seems that there are really very different ways in which things could pan out going forward. There's on the one hand room for improvement over the current system, and potentially actually a very great need for more coherence in the system, also to enable the future build-up of more renewable energy and more other low-carbon energy, and for a greater integration of European energy systems. And also as a means of, especially after following the change in the renewables target, to maintain investor security. But it could also be a process that leads to a further uncertainty in terms of policy and infrastructure, etc., through watering down of the existing system in terms of making member states actually accountable and have them contribute as they actually can to larger European targets and ambition. And so there are many additional items that we could go into and that I would enjoy talking with the two of you about, but for today we should come to a close. For those of us that have stayed with us until this point, I want to thank you all for participation. I also want to say that the next in the series of POLIMP webinars is going to be on the topic of climate finance, in particular with a view to the negotiations going on in the run-up to the Paris summit later in 2015, and the conversation will take place sometime in the second half of November. I hope that many of you will come and join us again for this conversation. So big thank you, and a recording of this conversation will be available, and other information is at polimp.eu, and I invite you all to have a go and have a look. Thank you very much, Katharina. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for joining us.
Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Katharina.
Bye-bye.